A pocket watch held by a young man named Joe in cornfield. A bloodied man in a suit appears from thin air. Kneeling before the young man, with no hesitation Joe raises a squat gun and blows the man apart with a single cough, revealing 4 silver bars of gold taped to the dead man's back. Joe drives up and parks his truck. Removes the wrapped corpse from the flatbed. Joe carries the body to an iron hatch, opens it, and dumps him in. Towards a mid-sized city on the horizon. Joe enters and puts his gun in a basket labeled, Loopers, Blunderbusses. Joe pulls 2 gold bars from his jacket. Jed pushes a wad of cash through the slot. Dale hands 4 gold bars through the slot, and Joe retrieves his gun and exits. On the bed, Joe shoots at the ceiling with his fingers. Racing with other loopers in trucks and sports vehicles on sooty city streets. A young looper called Seth on the road, and a dim yet light nightclub in the city center. Joe and Seth ring a doorbell, grin for a camera, and the door unlocks. A long dark corridor leads to a small antechamber with a coat check area for weaponry. Lacy women entertain men in an opulent parlor. Joe stands at the velvet curtained doorway to the rear room, observing Susie. Bold dark eyes. Big man brings her out through drapes. A fat madam stares at her ledger. The top has 5 or 6 juvenile loopers. Zach climbs the stairs with a smile. Joe and other loopers pass an eyedropper. Joe and the loopers are booted out by muscular gat men, followed by youngster Blue, pointing and cursing at them. Joe's Miata races through the abandoned city streets, racing with other loopers in trucks and sports cars. Joe looks at the youngsters. Late in the night, Seth explains that he cannot kill him, and a hog-tied man with a sack over his head appears, singing. Seth hesitates, and he stands with his gun in his limp arm, receding behind us as we run away. Seth breaks down crying. The kid turns his pistol and looks daggers. Abe pulls Joe out past Gat Men and Kid Blue. When he arrives home, a 55-year-old Seth limps up to a razor wire fence bordering the train yard with a weathered scar on his palm. B at 75, Wire Street IN 15, is clearly carved in the shape of an arrow, and his right hand is missing a finger. Now his middle finger is gone and his leg crumples, and old Seth crawls out, face mutilated, then collapses as his leg goes to the knees. Kid Blue steps from the doorway, shot him and pulls the corpse inside. Joe wakes up with a start. A hog-tied man with a sack on his head appears kneeling. Joe raises his gun without hesitation and shoots the man in the chest. He flips the man onto his back and stares at the man's face under the cloth sack. When he sees the guy and his own face staring at him, instead of blood under his shredded jacket, we watch piled gold bars stream. Now in his early 40s, is hard to spot. Old Joe follows her. Old Joe in bed in his late 50s. His wife goes in, says something insignificant, and touches his foot gently. Joe runs out of the bedroom, and gangsters grab him, taking him down with a rifle to the head. Then gangsters drag Joe out. They carry Joe in and put a sack over his head. Kid Blue and the tall Gat Man are putting their bars behind it. Old Joe runs out into the street as gunfire cracks from the high apartment window. Joe jumps from shadows and dives behind a trash as Abe smashes in, barely escaping. Joe sees Seth's apartment's bright red garage. Old Joe finishes printing enormous maps. Kid Blue shuts the peephole screen on Seth's apartment door and sits where Joe did. Joe stares at the kitchen counter. As in the last flashback, old Joe is half asleep in bed. A woman's arm around his neck stabilizes him. Old Joe enters, pulls his sleeve back and shows Joe the scar spelling. His wife spins as gangsters burst into the entryway. Joe punches old Joe square in the jaw, and he falls. 2 more behind him hit the dusty parking lot running. 3 Gat Men come out, followed by Joe. The 7 Gat Men, Kid Blue, and Joe fire their rifles at him. Joe rides at full speed into the thick corn stalks. Sarah, a young woman in work, uses a huge axe to cut the trunk. Sarah examines it. She glances back for a long time, then takes a shotgun above the door and plows outside. Joe sits in the same location. Abe fumes. But he recovers halfway. Sarah comes out onto the front porch and turns on the porch light. Joe is unconscious where we left him in the corn. Sarah's shout wakes him up and she disappears into the house without talking. Looks at Sid. She handcuffs his wrist to the cot and takes his revolver. Her exit involves placing it on a seat beside the entrance and turning off the lighting. Old Joe clutches his pocket watch like a talisman. Realize the Paris Club is packed and boisterous. Previously saw Old Joe's life. As Sarah approaches the barn, Joe sits on the ground outside the open barn door, still handcuffed to his wrist. Cleaning and loading his gun, Sarah pulls the shotgun and shoots him. The lengthy story ends with Joe barely speaking. Pulls a pen from a workstation. Joe sees the numbers. She creates lines with the pen. 07/15/39, 02935. We only see Old Joe's face. He puts his pistol away and leaves. Old Joe goes through the park. He has a map. A map beside him shows 3 ringed city residences. Sarah clutches the ripped map. Joe finishes gun assembly. Sarah glances toward Old Joe's hideout. In one hand, he grips his pocket watch while he vigorously washes his hands. The map underneath it. Joe wakes up startled. Sid brings Joe inside, calling him. A vehicle crashing behind him as he zips down an alleyway. A Gat man briefs, who hasn't slept much. Kid Blue, crouching on the 10th floor of a half-finished high-rise, looks down on the street bustle. He's looking for Old Joe. Joe fires his blunderbuss against an armored vehicle. Too far away, the shot scatters. Joe steps over the gold to approach Old Joe, who flinches and retreats. Kid Blue's shattered remains are beside him. Joe rises painfully. He knows Old Joe is gone. Sarah starts the vehicle. They roll down the muddy road to the highway. She unfastens them and they step out. Old Joe pauses and points. Joe escapes the stalks into the field. Short of breath. Finds his way. Old Joe, Sarah, and Sid are across the field. Sid hurries to Sarah, who sits up slowly. They hug Old Joe. Everything is unbelievable. Dreamlike. We hear no gunshot as Old Joe shoots Sarah slowly. Only the corn's breeze and young Joe's breathing. Back on the field, his mom Sarah is smiling and uninjured. Sarah turns away and brings Sid back to the farmhouse. She bathes and dresses his jaw wound, tucks him in, and hugs him close. Sarah crosses cornfield edge Joe's body. Sarah approaches him carefully. She kneels alongside him. Dirty pocket watch. Open. Ticking. No picture. She shuts it and strokes his hair. Wind in corn. Finally, the sun bursts through the clouds.